Hey guys, how's it going? This is Swamy from DP No More, and today I have a special video. Today I'm going to be chatting with Anna Ciaunica from the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL in London. She's also a researcher at the the Institute of Philosophy in Porto. Today is going to be a special episode because Anna has been someone who's been working and researching about depersonalization for a while, and she's written articles and papers about it. So I wanted to chat up with her and talk and just find out what she knows about depersonalization that can be helpful to others. It's also because I'm very interested in the topic of the self and depersonalization and how it affects the sense of self. So Anna is a specialist when it comes to this, so we're going to be talking about that as well. So just to give you, a fair bit of warning, we're going to be talking about what it means to have a sense of self. We're going to be talking about how depersonalization affects the sense of self. We're also going to be talking about topics such as death and things like that. So if you're right now feeling sensitive to all of those topics, then I would advise, just a word of caution. This is just a word of caution. I always believe that the more you know, and the truth will really help you. But I understand if you're in a sensitive place right now and you don't want to hear about any such conversations, then just feel free to skip it. But for the rest of us who are deeply interested in this topic, I think this is going to be a very, very informative and even entertaining episode. So let's get started. Anna, I just want to thank you for doing this. And why don't we just get to know a little bit more about who you are and how you really got interested in the topic of depersonalization in the first place.
Thank you so much, Swamy, for inviting me to talk about my research and about this topic, which is extremely interesting, but in the same time distressing because it affects so many people and it's underknown and understudied. So I'm trained as a philosopher. So that's my main training, but I'm a cognitive scientist. So this means that I collaborate with experimental scientists. They do experimental research on depersonalization, among other things. So based at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL in London. And I got interested in this subject because my main background is on conscious experience and specifically in self-conscious experience and self-consciousness. So I'm interested in how people get to become aware of themselves and what does it mean, right, from the first person perspective. And what got me interested into depersonalization, derealization, is the fact that this is such a difficult to describe phenomena from a traditional kind of like conceptual point of view, because it seems we have an experience in which people feel detached from their own first person subjective quality of their experiences, right? So this means that they have this feeling that they look at their own self, body, and the world from a detached and third person perspective all the time, and doesn't seem like a easy thing to grasp for someone who never experienced it. So I for instance, I never experienced it. So when people describe to me these experiences, because I'm collaborating with some with a peer support group in London called Unreal, and they kindly share these experiences with other researchers and with me as well, because they want to raise awareness on this disorder. So when they try to describe these experiences to me, it is very difficult to grasp it, right, in conceptual terms, right? So yeah, so it's one of the reasons I got interested, because I think it is precisely this phenomena and this type of phenomena that can teach us important things about our sense of self on a daily basis that we typically take for granted.
That's awesome. Yeah. The first time I experienced depersonalization many years ago, that was the first pronounced thing. I just felt like there is something off here. Like my sense of self is not the same as it was like 2 months ago. There's been something off. Um, do we know what is happening with the sense of self? Like what is going on? Is it like a switch that gets turned off, or is it something that's much more than that? Like what is really happening? Is there any understanding about that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So so I think the quick answer for that is we don't know yet. And this is why basically we need to research it more and understand it more. And what really need to do is to join forces from different perspectives and different disciplines to tackle it, because each discipline can come with its own baggage, its own approach. And sometimes you can't see things from just one perspective. You need to move around the phenomena to actually see it from different perspectives. So I think the quick answer would be like, okay, so philosopher approaches from one perspective to answer that your question. Experimental people will approach it from a different perspective, right? Clinician will approach it from a different perspective because they want to help people to treat them, to help them to cope on a daily basis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Neuroscientists are interested in from their perspective because they want to know what is happening in the brain, right, during this phenomenon. So at least, so you have many perspectives, at least four, disciplines that kind of like try to tackle this phenomena with their methodological tools and then conceptual toolbox and everything. We don't have yet a unifying understanding of what is going on there. But there are many people that, attempt and try to figure out what is going on and to join forces from different disciplines. So I think that's encouraging. There is also more and more awareness in the media. So like articles for the general public, and people start to, become aware that this is a condition that is widely spread. But yeah, so I think the honest and quick answer is we don't have an answer for what is going on. And this is why we need to basically research more on this. But we do know a couple of things, right, that need to be taken, as I said, with precaution, because it's still an ongoing investigation, it's still an ongoing research. So very basically, we do know, very basic thing is that humans are living organisms that are thriving to survive and potentially reproduce. So this means that at a very low level, our brain receives all the information from the external world and from our body, and they try to keep a balance, what they call homeostatic balance, within the required limits, right, for survival. So if it's too hot in this room, for instance, for my body to take it, I need to move out or to open the window or something, right? Why is this important? To set up this background which is connected with body, because we need to understand why the body reacts and the brain reacts in a certain way to a certain threat that comes from the outside, right? So it has been proposed that a depersonalization and this feeling of detachment, self-detachment, is a natural response. So a natural mechanism that our, nature put in place, like so evolution put in place, to keep you safe from the risk of crashing against otherwise unbearable psychological fact, right? So if you risk to crash against a reality that you can't really process it, there is a sort of I'm borrowing this metaphor from Sarah Lowy in London. She created this metaphor of an experiential airbag that the brain creates between you and reality to prevent you crash against it, something which would be unbearable. And because the brain's job is to keep you alive no matter what, so evolution find that trick to say, okay, so I'm going to dissociate, I'm going to detach from this because this is too awful, but it's not happening to you, right? You're safe, you're safe, right? This is happening to someone else, right? So there is this dissociation that it's supposed to be a healthy mechanism to deal with a highly unhealthy situation, right? For the survival of your physical and mental integrity, right? And basically, I think many of us in daily basis, they have already experienced this kind of like phenomena. For instance, think when you're extremely stressed, extremely fatigued, or when you have a jet lagged, right? Or extremely drunk, or probably you took some recreational drugs. You might have, or just suppose you just had a car accident and you survive from it, and you get out from the car and you look at yourself doing the movements, but it's not really you, right? You see yourself from afar, from like a floating, right? So that means that dissociation mechanism already kicks in to keep you far from something which is otherwise extremely nocive for your organism, right? Now, in most of the cases, luckily, that kind of like experiential airbag gets wrapped again, gets wrapped back, and then you get back again to the reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you continue your immersive, daily life. But in some cases, what it seems that is happening in the case of depersonalization, which turns into depersonalization disorder, is that airbag seems to remain stuck, like inflated, right? And you can't really engage anymore directly with yourself and reality, because there is kind of always a lag between the two, right? And you take that perspective all the time. And I think this is a very subtle matter, because our mental life it's very rich and very nuanced and complicated, and it's difficult to describe it with words. Sometimes we need to use metaphors. And I think one beautiful metaphor is that of transparent window. So many people would say that, for instance, in the phenomenological tradition, would say that typically in daily life, our experiences are transparently accompanied by what we call a sense of self, right? We don't realize it, but we have it all the time because we take it for granted, right? It's there all the time without us realizing that it's there. So I think that the clearest example is that of very clean and transparent window that is in between you and the landscape, let's say, and you have the feeling that basically you are in the landscape, but basically there is something which mediates your access to the landscape, and that's a transparent sense of self. And the idea would be that the more transparent the glass, the more you have that feeling of immersiveness, right? Now, there are cases where you can attend to the glass itself, to the transparent. And typically that's the case what people would do in meditation, right? So I'm attending to what I am experiencing, at the experience itself, right? So I'm attending to that self, that I who is seeing through the window, right? So I can do that, right, in meditation. But I think what is happening in the depersonalization is that there's a crack in the window. For some reasons, something which is related with your bodily processing that is happening in the brain, but also in your entire body, because the body is not completely, obviously, it's not disconnected from your, the brain is not disconnected from your body. So the two form a single unity. So what is happening is that because there are some alteration at the level of, like, let's say, sensory processing, which is related with the self, then there is a crack in that transparent sense of self. And you can see it now that there is a self processing there, and then stands in the way. And that fits very nicely with the self-reports of the people that suffer from depersonalization. I would say that they try to retrieve the lost self. They try to figure out what is going on, and they spend a lot of time like focusing on their inner experiences, right? It's precisely because something that was there all the time without us being aware that is there, like the self, now is altered, now is cracked, and attracts attention, right? So if I see a crack in the window, first of all, I can see now that there was a window there where I thought there was nothing. And the second, the crack in the window might impede me to actually see through the window, right? So, and now I can see the reality is shattered, right? I can't really, and that stands in the way between me and that feeling of immersiveness into reality, and also in connection with myself. So I feel, and that might get that very strange feeling that of being in the same time here, doing things, but is sometimes there, right? We're looking at me from the outside perspective. But as I said, these are just suggestions, just speculation, like theory. We still need a more rigorous approach and more experimental data to actually put that theory.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Let's actually talk about that. Like, how do we actually, like, what will research look like for depersonalization? We both agree that we do need research, but what is that going to look like? Because this experience is so subjective. Like, how can anyone, like what do we do to objectively study and understand it? I'm not even sure, like maybe this even applies to other mental disorders like depression or anxiety, but it's fairly common that uh, illnesses like depression and anxiety exist, that even the researchers who are who are studying it kind of would have experienced depression or anxiety, so they have some sort of understanding about it. But it almost seems like most people who are studying depersonalization in a clinical setting, and who have not experienced depersonalization, I'm trying to understand how can research be done when this experience is like very, very subjective.
Yeah, so I think the experience is by definition are subjective. So whatever you experience, so that's one of what the philosophy would call the hard problem of like consciousness, is that whatever you do, you cannot escape the fact that actually I don't have access to your experiences, even in normal basis, in typical cases, and you don't have access to my experience, right? So in typical cases. But then, the problem then comes from the fact that you need to study a subjective phenomenon. In this case, depersonalization. But as you said, can be depression, can be many other things, right? Like anxiety, anorexia, or many other phenomena. So the problem is, how can you study a subjective phenomena from a scientific third-person objective point of view, right? So that's a major issue, but I think it's doable, and it's doable because we can join forces between different disciplines, right, and try to come up with something like a more refined and nuanced understanding of a phenomenon. So, for instance, what you can do is, first of all, start with the phenomena itself, right? With the people that are experiencing this. So engage with them, gather like the first-hand reports from them, lived experiences. This is something that clinicians already do a lot because they are in front line. They meet these people on a daily basis and they need to answer their questions. Then what you can do next is try to see whether you can develop first-person qualitative methods that people that experience this phenomena can use to actually say something, convey a message, right? And that message can be somehow measured, right, between participants. Because if you have the same tool that you apply to different people, then you can gather something that you can objectively measure. Yeah. Then you can use interesting task that you can ask people to do, behavioral task, and at the same time measure what is happening in the brain while they're doing their task, and to figure out exactly which type of like brain processing underlines which type of reported experience, subjective experience, like I feel this or I feel that, right? So that's something you can do. Ideally, it would be nice to actually have all these methods gathered under one umbrella to understand the phenomena. But as I said, this is something that still needs to be done, and there is a lot of work to do because the experimental data is relatively scarce compared with other disorders, which is quite strange given that it's the third most common psychological symptom of the anxiety and low mood in the general population, right? Mm-hmm. So, and when you said you said that sometimes it's difficult for the scientists to examine a phenomena that they haven't experienced. Well, as a scientist, I engage with many of my colleagues and I try to explain to them my research, and sometimes people will come, my colleagues, the scientists will come to me and say, wait a minute, but actually I'm experiencing that, Yeah. So, yeah, I know that, so they know that from a first person perspective, except that they don't know that they know it, right? They don't know that they have it because there is no awareness. Imagine if you don't have a contrast, right? So you go through that experience all the time, but if you don't have a contrast to something which is like before or after, then it's difficult to and also if you don't have as I said, because it's such a subtle experience, you don't have the tools, you don't have the words to actually express it properly, and people will say, what do you mean? Just to give you just one very simple example. So for instance, one of the markers of depersonalization in comparison with psychosis, for instance, is that reality testing is intact. So this means that people know that whatever they experience is a subjective phenomena, but not the reality itself, right? So if you pinch someone with depersonalization, give me a harmful signal, so they will correctly withdraw the arm in response to the painful stimuli. And they will say something, I know this pain is mine, but doesn't feel like being mine, right? So imagine how difficult it is to actually explain to people in daily life. It's like, so I see you that you withdraw the arm to the pain, so this means that you feel it, right? You know that arm is yours, right? That hand is yours. You don't want your hand to be in pain, so you withdraw the arm. And you tell me that actually you know that that pain is yours, but you also tell me that doesn't feel that your pain is your pain, right? So, and that seems to tap into this very idea of like a altered subjective sense of self. It is the very subjectivity of the experience is somehow changed and altered. Yeah.
Yeah, that is the very interesting part about depersonalization, which kind of brings us to the core, topic of the day, which is, something you wrote an article on Eon called "What Does Depersonalization? What can depersonalization tell us about the sense of self?" Which is super interesting, and I've always had this interest and curiosity about what is the self. Is this like a subjective phenomena that occurs because of some kind of, is it like an emergent phenomena of the brain, or is there something like hardcore, or like is there like an essence of self, or like what do you think it is, and what can depersonalization like tell us about this sense of self?
Yeah, so again, this is a huge debate in the literature with all
Yeah.
disciplines, traditions, but I do have a stance on it. So I'm going to tell you my point of view. So I'm not saying that this is the answer. I'm saying this is what I think is happening there. So take it with caution. So, so depending on what commitments you have as a theory level, right? You can say that a self is a thing or not a thing, right? So I'd say most of the time, if you take a like ontology, the self is not a thing like, I don't know, this cup, right? It's not the same. So it's not a material thing, like in the sense like the cup is, right? But in the same time, you can't say that the self is somehow floating in the air, right? Like in a dualistic manner, like mind-body dualism, like so you can't say that there is a substance which is not material, which is the self, which somehow comes to us and inhabits our body, right? I believe that we need to go back to something very basic, which is our body in the world, and how we are biological organism, and we are biological self-organizing organism, right? So this means that we develop from a cell to an organism, and everything, all this kind of like processing, it's centered around this kind of like self-preservation. I want to survive myself, right? It's myself who wants to survive, my organism. And that kind of self-centered bodily processing is necessarily around the self, right? So the body and the brain keeps track of itself, so to speak, right? Because you want to live, you want to keep going living. And actually, this is something that you can't really control. So you can see it very clearly in a sad case. So for instance, if you wanna commit suicide, if you wanna kill yourself, you can't commit suicide by ordering your cells to actually stop for function, right? To say, okay, now you stop. I don't care about, yeah.
Right.
So I can, take something like a poison, but my body, my cells would fight for themselves, hence for me, for the self, right? You know what I mean? So they will fight for me without me being aware that actually they will fight for me, right?
Right.
So there is a sense in which that kind of like core self, minimal self, is fundamentally embodied and stays there until the day we die, right? It's like when we breathe, when we walk, when we think, so everything is somehow related, for better and for worse, right? As I said.
Right.
Now, that core sense of self, right, which is deeply embodied and is connected, as I said, with all our cells, with all our organs, and also with how we interact with the world and with others. Then at the high level of the, let's say, processing, that comes with a feeling, right? A certain feeling, a feeling of like a sense of self, not the self processing in itself.
Right.
It's not the same as, it shouldn't be conflated with like the self from the self-organizing body organism, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sense of self is something that you have at the level of conscious experience. It's something that you can see, you can feel, and that's deeply subjective, as I said. It's like I feel it in a certain way, right? So for instance, another example to make this point clearer. So, so for an if I'm an anorexic person, I can see myself very fat. So whenever I look in a mirror, so I can see myself very fat, even though my bodily core self, primary self, is basically very, very thin and actually dangerously so, right?
Right.
But what I feel is my reality. So the subjective sense of self gives you my reality, and I live as if I was extremely fat and I want to get thinner, right? So, or I want to cease to exist for many reasons, right? So that sense of subjective sense of like experience gives us the sense of reality that is there, and that's is one of the dangers that we have in with many of the like the self disorders. It's because it's so difficult to get out from that kind of like subjective reality to contrast it against something which is there, right?
Yeah.
Physically, objectively there.
So in a way, if I can put this into this like model that I've actually I'm thinking about, let's say there are two kinds of self. Like, let's say there is this embodied self, which is your whole body, and the self that is like your body, your cells, your organs, that is the embodied self. And then there is this something else called the mental self, for the lack of a better word. And then for most people, like, these two are kind of like not one and the same. There's not clear like demarcation between these two self. And then do you think for people suffering from depersonalization or dissociation in general, is there like a split between these two selves, of like this mental self is like split off from the body self? And is dissociation just a split between the body and the mind? Because that's how like I've been seeing depersonalization in myself. It almost feels like there's my body self. There's it doesn't need my conscious awareness. It knows how to operate. It knows how to breathe, sleep, eat, and like replenish my body. And then I have this like mental self, which is just like where all of my thoughts are, my story. Some people would call it my ego, right? And is dissociation something like a split off between those two, like a cut off between those two?
Well, it certainly felt that way. So that somehow echoes other self-reports that I gathered. For instance, in London, people would say like, I feel trapped inside my head and outside my body. Or I can see myself from the back of my own head and I'm on automatic pilot, right? Because as you said, it's like this, this day-to-day functioning of the self, of the body is going there. So your lungs are breathing without you getting involved, right? So they breathe for you. So the body itself is functioning. Luckily, you want them to function, right? You want your lungs to function. You want your heart to function for you, right? What I think is going on is there is indeed a split. It's like an imbalance, right? But I think that split comes precisely from the fact that people, it's fueled by the fact that people try to figure out what is going on, right? So the more time you spend like focusing on this kind of like disruptions that you experience, the more you basically almost withdraw yourself into the safe realm, as you said, of the mental self, because I can intellectualize what I think, what I feel, and try to figure out, right? So I'm kind of withdrawing myself into the mental self, for, as you said, for lack of better word.
Yeah.
And I'm disconnecting myself from the body itself. And it's quite interesting because people would say something like, you know, it's when I'm doing very dumb stuff like gardening or, you know, doing something with my hands, wherever, so I forget about myself, you know, I forget to think about myself, right? And then I realize, oh, actually, I have I have my sense of self back, right? But as soon as I realize it, it fades away, right? As if the the fact that you attend to, remember when I said when the transparent window, when you attend to the self, right, you can see it's there, then immediately it becomes visible. So it hinders, right, the immersive feeling. So it's so important. I think what depersonalization teaches us is the importance of invisible things and the importance of things that we take for granted in the everyday life that we have there and we don't realize that we have there. And I think in the personalization, sadly, people realize that they do have a sense of self. So we do have a sense of self, except that it's changed, it's modified, it's not the same as before, and it stands in the way between their own experiences and the feeling of immersiveness in the world. Yeah. So I'd say, if I'm right, I might be wrong. I'd say that the more people will try to actively forget about themselves and stop worrying about themselves, about their former self or the sense of self, and engage in very low level, very simple things, activities with their bodies in the world, right? The more you go back to the basis, which is, as I said, is like this bodily self, which is still there. Yourself is still there. You're breathing, you're alive. You withdraw your arm into the pain if you feel the pain. So the job is done for the self-preservation, right? Definitely done, right? But the more go back to the basis, I'd say that the higher phenomenological sense of self will come for free, right? But if you approach the problem from the other way around, from the top down, so to speak, from the first, I need to figure out what is wrong in the brain, what is this happening here in my head, and once I figure out, then I'm going to apply, you know, once I figure out, I'm going to understand, you know, then I sort it out, right? I don't think it's working, and this is not going to work for a very basic reason. So I'm just to give you one comparison, one example. So if somebody learns what is going on in your brain when your body swims, right? So you know everything what is going on in your brain when your body needs to swim. Now, and if somebody actually swims, right, as you learn how to swim. Now, if I throw you into the water, just by knowing what is going on in your brain when you swim, are you going to be able to actually swim, right? So my answer, my hunch would be no. This is just by knowing what is going on in the neural mechanism in the brain, it's not going to give you the actual experience of swimming. So what you really need to go back to go back to is the experience of being a self in the world, and that goes necessarily by being immersed into the world, because we are not isolated, right? We need to interact with things, we need to interact with people. And anecdotally, as I said, this is still ongoing work. We still need to figure out what is going on there. So I'm saying again and again and again, we need to be cautious. But from my observation, what I see is that people need to, because sometimes dissociation and depersonalization is a fluctuating feeling. So sometimes you are more or less detached, you feel more or less detached. Well, you know better than me because you experience this. So it's not as if you are in a dissociative state, you know, all the time the same way. So it comes with high or low level intensities, right? So people sometimes told me that when they feel that they go into the high level intensity dissociative states, they feel the need to immediately interact, have closer interaction with objects in the world, right? So to move around, to smell things, to touch things, sometimes even get very close physically with the closed ones, right? Like to have the tactile experiences. And kind of that comes like a natural response and intuitive response, because suppose I lost track of my hand. I don't know where my hand is in space for some reasons, because let's say there is some alteration in the way my brain processes the information, the sensory information from my hand. What do I do, right? So if I touch with my hand an object, that object will give information to my brain of where the not me or the not I is, right? So I know where the object is. So the contrast between I and non-I and me and non-me gives you the information where the I is, right? So this is why I need this kind of like contrast. And this is why when people would go, or they have the feeling that they go in this kind of high level dissociative states, they feel the need to engage, because that is precisely the contrast of the engagement with the external world, and the sensory engagement with the external world gives them extra information about themselves, right? So where the self is, where is my hand, where do I feel, what I'm feeling right now. So so I think that's something very very striking and very important. We have to keep that in mind, because the natural response would be to, as you said, to withdraw into one's head and try to figure out what is going on. But by doing this, it's like you basically, you're fueling the problem, right?
I couldn't agree more. That's what I actually told to people if they want to recover, is that stop obsessing about depersonalization and or derealization. Like the more we obsess about it, the more we get inward focused, when like our focus should be outward. And like, as you put it, like being in the world, we must be immersed in the world and try to live a normal life and try to do the things that you normally do, even if you're not doing them at like full capacity. And that's the key to recovery, is just being like focused outward and not being completely focused inward, like a spotlight is shining on you all the time, or you're constantly thinking about depersonalization and you're constantly trying to get rid of it or trying to get out of it. It almost becomes like a quicksand, where the more you struggle to get rid of it, the more you're aware of your struggle, the more you're aware of depersonalization, and it just becomes this vicious cycle. When you start to accept it, and when you let go, and you just tell yourself, okay, I'm gonna feel like this, like for a while, and maybe I'll eventually get out of it. But until then, I'm gonna go outside. I'm gonna talk to my friends, even if it feels weird. I'm gonna go grocery shopping, even if the fluorescent light in my supermarket makes me feel weird. I'm just gonna keep doing it, and in a way, that's one of the key things to do. That key things you can do to recover is just be immersed in the world and be outward focused. So like, I found that very interesting that you brought it up as well, because I couldn't agree more about it.
Yeah, I like very much your metaphor of the quicksands. I think it's very telling. It's like everybody knows, it's like if you fell into quicksands, the worst thing you can do is just start struggling, right?
Yeah,
Because the more
exactly.
movement you do, it's like the more deeper you delve, right? And I think it is precisely my happening with the personalization. So I'm currently writing a paper with some of my colleagues and collaborators, and the title we choose is, because we could try to copy Descartes as like cogito ergo sum,
Right.
I think therefore I exist. We try to say I overthink, therefore I'm not, right? So the idea would be that if you think too much and you kind of get trapped into your head, then paradoxically you lose the sense of realness of your experiences, right? So everything becomes unreal precisely because it's, as people would say, it's academic, it's intellectual, but it's not, it's not embodied, it's
Right.
not and the life, right? So and also that comes, I think it comes because many of the people that I've encountered, that they complain about depersonalization, they are highly sensitive and observant people, right? So this is happening with kind of like preparing terrain. So it doesn't happen just to anybody. It has to be like a terrain that prepares that. And we are talking here about the highly sensitive and observant people, like intelligent, sensitive, and they used to just observe things, and also almost like without even realizing, they take that kind of like observer perspective of what is going on the existence, on life, on the self, on suffering, on many meaning of life and other people and society in general. So and that terrain is kind of like prepared, right? But I think when it happens that that kind of that dissociation is like it's deeply rooted and installed, I think we should go back and use the roots that the nature put us at our disposal, which are the invisible, as I said, the invisible basis of our sense of self, which is the body roots, right? We need to go back and use the basic things like movement, because we are a creature that we're designed to move and to move with others, right? So if we don't move, we don't survive, and if we are not with others, we don't survive others. So we are highly dynamic social creatures, right? And whenever we experience like alteration in our psychological and mental life, the natural tendency is just like to sit,
Right.
and try to figure out what is going on and to isolate, right? But the thing is, like, the human being is not like a mechanical car, like an engine, right? So what do you do if you have a car which is broken, right? It doesn't work anymore. You stop the car, open and try to fix it, what is going on, and then start again, right? But that's not what is happening with a biological living creature, because we are all the time on the move. We cannot afford to stop, right? And fix everything, because we are constantly bombarded with information. We are in a flow of information, in a flow life. You have family and you have friends and you have work, you have your body, you have your smells and experiencing. So the flow experience cannot be stopped, right? So I think this approach of like, okay, so let's stop now, try to fix whatever the mechanics is go wrong, and then an isolation, because obviously you have to take the car, I can't find the English word. It's like when you fix the car, and then once it's going on, you just like get it back again in the world and on the road, and it will roll, right? As living creatures, sadly, we cannot afford to do that. So we have to somehow learn how to fix ourselves on the fly, right, and dynamically. And this means that we need to use the exact same tools to actually get better. Namely, we are dynamic creatures, so we need to use movement. And we are social creatures, so this means we need to use interaction with others to get better. As you said, it's crucial to stay in touch with others. It's crucial to stay in touch and to interact with the world in this moment. It's very important. Yeah.
I 100% agree. I was kind of wondering, do you think there's going to be ever a time in the future where there might be like a pill that one can swallow and just be cured of depersonalization or derealization? Is that ever going to be like a magic pill cure or an overnight cure? What are your thoughts and ideas about that?
The quick answer is no. Simply because we know very well, so there's never going to be a pill that will solve anything in the brain, not just the personalization. Yeah. So you can take pills to actually deal with some of the symptoms to them, though. but it is not going to solve the problem at the roots, right? As soon as you stop taking the pill, the problems will come back. So I think I'm not saying we shouldn't take pills. I think these are complementary measures that people need to take, prescribed by the doctors and everything. They need to be followed, and they need to be carefully. You can't simply take pills like this. But what I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's is that easy, sadly, right? But so that's the bad news, right? The good news is that actually that's a good thing, because this means that people can have agency over their own healing, right? So it's not as if there is something like literally just like that module in your brain, it doesn't work, and if you take that pill, it will fix it, and it's like, okay, you're going to get better. No, it's something that you can literally take the matter in your hands, and you realize that it's a web of interaction that you have with your own experiences into the world that make you feel the way you feel, right? And it's not just in the brain, it's also in the body and in the context in which you are. As you said, it's like maybe the lights are not the correct lights, right? Or the emotional environment in which I'm kind of like at work or in family is not optimal, right?
Yeah.
So that has nothing to do with my brain, right? My brain functioning is the way my brain responds to a certain experience or reality out there, right? And why is this good news? Is because, well, you can remove yourself from that, right? You have agency over that. So I can, if it's something that is related to the way I relate to, let's say, with the lights, I can move into a different room, which I can't if it's something just in my brain, because I can't simply change my brain. Right? In that sense, it's like, okay, I'm going to shop another one, right? Because this one is not good. So it's not a matter of just in brain or just in environment. What I'm trying to say, it's like a very fine balancing between the two. And we need to keep that in mind all the time, that we are dynamic social creatures, and we need to use those tools to get better whenever we feel that we disconnect from ourselves.
Awesome. Yeah. I know we're running a little bit over time, but I just have maybe couple, 2 or 3 more questions, if you don't mind. One is, I wanted to ask, there's this fascinating, I would call it symptom of depersonalization, where a person kind of becomes obsessed with philosophical questions and existential questions. I don't know if you're aware of this. So someone who has no interest in philosophy, someone who has no interest in the big questions in life, after becoming depersonalized, can get bombarded with such thoughts about what is life, what does existence mean, is there an afterlife, am I a soul living. It kind of gets to the point where it becomes too much, that's what you're constantly thinking about. And so I suffered from this, and I've talked to other people who, and it's not that everybody who experiences depersonalization suffers from this. It's just that only it happens to few people, but it's very strong that they get bombarded with these philosophical questions. And some of these questions are about their sense of self itself. Sometimes you are wondering, what am I? What is a self? How can I hear my own thoughts? Who am I? And it's so fascinating to me for someone who has no interest in philosophy or anything, who's just a normal person working a day job, to suddenly become obsessed with these kinds of questions after depersonalization. I'm kind of curious if you've heard about this or if you have any idea why this happens.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, and you know what? It is my hunch that because we are living in a pandemic, this kind of like philosophical question will pop up way more in
Yeah.
typical daily life. Why? And I think it's somehow related with your question. Is because
Just to interrupt a little bit, I just want to say, like, this has been happening before the pandemic as well.
yeah. But what I want, so I'm going to link my reply in connection with the pandemic, is because I think what is going on there is again a response of the organism, yourself, your brain, and your body, to a change that it was perceived as a threat, right? So as a dangerous threat, right? So if you feel that you're getting close to something which is potentially very dangerous for yourself, right? Like death, right? Then you start wondering yourself, have I lived the way I was supposed to live? What do I really want from life? Who am I? What is the meaning of all this? I think it's precisely because you encounter an extreme situation, right? Then this kind of like underlying existential question that you typically don't have because everything is going smoothly, right? They come at the surface, and then you say, oh, if I'm dying tomorrow, it's like, I want to know. It's like, what is the existence? Why am I here? It's like, where am I going? Who am I, right? And I think this type of feelings comes, maybe they are exacerbated in depersonalization because, as I said, it's somehow related with a disrupted way of like relating to your thinking self. So I overthink, right? But I think this type of like existential questions pop off the surface in reaction to a fear, underlying fear of like non-existence, right? So you are afraid of stop existing, which is, I think all the organisms have this, but except that the humans, they are aware that they won't exist anymore, right?
Exactly.
So we have that awareness that, it's going to come, and it's coming for all of us, right? And sometimes that can be takes over, right, as you said. And when it takes over, then the quicksands come in, right? And the more and more you kind of like, because whether or not you're going to ask yourself what existence is or what life is, there is one big fact that is inescapable, is that we are all going to die one day. So that's something we cannot escape, right? And the brain somehow forgets about it, right? It makes you forget about it, right? But when the threat comes, I gave the example of a pandemic, right? Because that's an immediate threat. But I think what is happening right now is that there's chance that actually these feelings come more often at the surface because the threat is more real and more visible, right? It's like I can go outside and meet the virus, and yeah. So so it's a matter of like bringing at the surface something which is like underlying the human condition anyway, right? It's just like in depersonalization, this is exacerbated, and people run in circles around it.
Yeah, I actually do think that we're thinking all of these thoughts all the time, even like normal people, but it's so buried beneath the awareness. And then for people who are like undergoing DP, it just like comes up and you become like more aware of these thoughts. I feel like a part of us is always contemplating these questions. Maybe it's not vocalizing like in like sentences, but it's always thinking about these things, about like what am I, like what am I doing in this world. In fact, it's kind of like, I feel like people who experience depersonalization and derealization, or in some ways normal, than the normal people, because normal people, you exist in the world, and you like, sometimes it's such a bizarre thing to exist in the world, but our mind just like quietens all of that, because if we are just fascinated and bewildered by reality all the time, no work will get done, right? But people with derealization are kind of fascinated, bewildered, and scared by reality all the time, and it kind of like affects the way they live, because they cannot get work done. It affects their day-to-day life. And so I feel like people who are normal, like their brain kind of like suppresses like all of that information, and just like gives them like maybe 2 bits of like 8 bits of information so that they can get work done. um, it's kind of like this thing that I've been like thinking about.
I understand that because, well, imagine a brain that knows that one day is going to stop functioning. Will be, well, why should I bother? I'm going to stop functioning anyway. It's like,
Right.
so why bother, right? But then you have this idea, okay, so you need to survive, but also reproduce, so to pass on, so to transmit something like information, right? So, yeah, I mean, one thing that we need to keep in mind, which is quite interesting, is that the word contemplation kind of like triggered this idea in me right now, is that in Greek, theory means contemplation, right? So so when you're doing like a theoretical model of something, so you're doing theory means that you contemplate, right? You draw yourself from something, and in order to see it, right? So this means that contemplation, like theoretical mode of being, right, it takes over, right, over the praxis, like the practical things, right, that you have to do in depersonalization, right? Ideally, nobody has the ideal way to actually how to live. It's just like it's a big mess. You need to figure out. It's like it depends on so many factors. So there is no one single way to actually do it properly, right? There is no normal and abnormal. It's just like you try to adapt the way you do. Ideally, it would be good to have a good balance between theory, like try to figure out, contemplate what I'm doing, and also engagement with the world, which is the praxis, right, the practical matter. But that's in theory. I mean, again, that's in theory. That's ideally. And reality, you just, and I actually, anecdotally, the people who accepted that the new way of they sensing the self is the normal way, they recovered more quickly, right? So It's a way of like, it's a way of accepting the fact, okay, so I've lost the way of like engaging with the world. It's not going to be the same again. But I have this one, right? And that's okay. Okay, also. So you have a new way of actually of flexibly adapting to the environment, and that damps down the fear, right? The fear of the unknown, right? You learn how to accept the new, the new real, the new self,
The new normal.
the new normal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly 100% agree. Like, that acceptance is the key. Just stop fighting with what has been happening and just like accept. Doesn't mean that you are going to be stuck like this forever, but for now, let's just like give in and accept this, like consider this normal. Don't struggle, don't obsess about depersonalization. Just try to live your life, go out. And then the depersonalization will like lift, for the way that I see it, right? Your body kind of wants to get out of depersonalization all the time. It doesn't want to be depersonalized. Just like, being in a car with an airbag inflated, that's not how you're supposed to drive a car. And the airbag will automatically deflate after a while, right? So in the same way, the depersonalization will automatically lift if you just accept it and give into it and let it do its thing, like let it do its job. And then maybe like a month or 2 months or maybe even 6 months, you'll start to see like, hey, I'm not even thinking about depersonalization anymore. Like, I sort of feel normal. I'm like interacting with people. I'm interacting with my friends, and I haven't even like thought about depersonalization or anything like that. But there are always like certain people who just don't get that, and they're constantly thinking about depersonalization. They're constantly trying to get it out. And because they are constantly trying to get out of depersonalization, all of their energy is just focused on depersonalization. It's kind of crazy just how certain people can get mired into that quicksand, and how certain people can just like let go and just like accept. It kind of, makes me feel like, makes me think that, you know, maybe there are people, like, for example, people in the third world who do experience depersonalization, maybe severely, but they tend to accept this because they have always accepted their fate. When you're a person in the third world, you don't like fight to get better. You don't fight to like improve like your condition. You just mostly accept and resign to your fate. And in most cases, that is not what you should do. Like, if you're feeling oppressed, if someone is oppressing you, you got to fight back, right? But with depersonalization, I feel like you shouldn't be fighting back, and you should be doing what the person in the third world is actually doing, which is just resign to your fate, accept it. And paradoxically, that's when the depersonalization will start to lift. And the more we fight, the more we get mired with depersonalization. That's just something that I've been like, I've been always like advocating for. And I actually have like maybe like one last question. We were talking about death and things like that, like the fun topic of death. So I thought maybe I could ask you this question. It's not maybe related to depersonalization, but I think it's related to your research about the sense of self and things like that. Do you think the self survives death? Do you think consciousness survives death? What are your thoughts about it?
Oh, you mean if there is so I'm not I'm not a mind or soul body or mind body dualist.
Uh-huh.
So I clearly don't think that there is some immaterial substance that will survive our material substance, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
disappears when we die. The body disappears, and the immaterial substance, soul, mind, body, whatever, mind or psyche or whatever, will survive after that. However, I do believe that because we are intrinsically linked to the way our physical makeup is construed and structured, right? There might be a different way of us actually existing, right? So in the sense where so I don't exist like this person when I'm dead, right? So my body disintegrates. So there's a different way of like, maybe, I don't know, my cells or they will feed some worms, which will feed some plants or whatever. So it's like, I believe that what we call the living being is like the self-organizing system. It's a way of like structuring the matter, right? The physical makeup. It's just one way of doing it, right? But there are other ways of doing it, right? So in that sense, I believe that I will continue to exist after my death, right? But not under the same form, right, that I have right now, right?
Okay. I mean, would
But
you
that's
say like
but that's
you
very
continue?
speculative.
I'm sorry,
It's
what?
very speculative. It's very speculative, right? I have no
Yeah,
idea.
exactly.
Maybe there is actually a Anna soul that will look at me from above, saying, you're wrong."
Yeah, yeah. Like I've always like wondered, like I've had a out of body experience, not because of depersonalization, but because like I was I was maybe 10 years old or something like that. I was just out of my body just for like a brief few seconds, and then I snapped back in. So I'm always like curious about things like that, and I've like watched a lot of people talk about their near-death experience. So it makes me wonder, like, whether there's an essence that is you, that you can call yourself, that is somewhere in your brain or somewhere in your body, that is just like observing all of these things happening to you, and then once you die, that self like goes away somewhere else. It's I mean, I 100% agree, it's all speculative, it's probably not grounded in like this scientific model, but I always like to ask these questions to people.
Well, I don't know. I personally believe that I like the body and I like the physical matter.
Yeah.
I I tend to believe that maybe I can have like a subjective illusion or hallucination of me going on, but I tend to believe that actually me is this, right? Is this, and I cannot separate the self or the soul or the mind from this particular makeup, right? And then when this is kind of disintegrated, starts to exist in a different form, right? Ashes or ground or whatever. So that's a different way of existing, right? But to answer whether we can have like a sort of like above level, like immaterial level from which we kind of contemplate the material, I don't know. I really don't know. It's like people believe what they, what they want to believe, that they find useful to believe, what they feel that is true. Yeah. So I think
You know
that's
what?
yeah. It's such a, I
I
mean, it's a good question, right?
it is definitely, yeah. And I think that's a great point to leave this conversation at, is that I don't know. But I want to thank you, Anna, for giving us your time and like talking about all of these interesting topics. I'm sure people who are watching have learned a little bit more than they already know. Just I want you to tell our viewers, like, where can they find out more about you? Are you on Twitter? Are you on any social media? Where can they go to know more about you and your work?
Thank you so much, Swamy, for inviting me. I always like to take my research from the armchair, out of the armchair, out of the box, out of the lab, to actually engage with people and exchange experiences. So you can reach me. So you will have my name on the
I
video,
will.
and if you
Yeah.
Google me, I have a website, and it pops out quite easily. I also have a Twitter account, so everything you will find it on Google.
I'll make sure to add your Twitter, your website, and your name and everything on the video right now.
I'm very happy, as I said, to engage with people, because it gives me a natural and subjective entrance point into the phenomena. It's like this type of engagement. I don't want to understand what is depersonalization just by studying the brain. I can do that, but I don't want to. I don't want to do just that. I think it's also very important to study what people feel, like the experiences that they have, because that then can tell us enormously, can tell us a lot about their story and their struggles, and how we can help people suffering from this condition, and also
Awesome.
obviously to raise awareness. Right?
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm sure we will have a lot more to talk to, and probably we can do like a round two of this again once more sometime in the future. But thank you so much for this time, and I wish you and your research all the very best and for the future.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.